Hello and welcome to the syntax lecture for the 11th time. This week we're going to be looking at clauses again, but this time we'll be concentrating on a particular type of clause which we haven't said an awful lot about up until now, and that's the infinitival clause. Before we get started, let's go over what we've said about clauses once more, just to remind everybody, because we haven't been looking at clauses for a few weeks. Now, this here is a picture of the clause as we have it. And as we've said before, clauses have these three different levels. There's a VP down at the bottom, an IP in the middle, and a CP at the top. These three levels of the clause have very different functions within the clause in terms of how they're interpreted. We'll start at the bottom and look at the VP. Now, the VP is that part of the structure which, at least at the beginning, contains the predicate and all its arguments. So the verb starts off there, and all the arguments of the verb, the subject argument, or the agent, and the theme, and things like that, they all start off downstairs in that verb phrase. Now, they don't all stay there, however, because the highest argument in the verb phrase is going to eventually move to the subject position. And it depends on which is the highest argument, and that itself depends on what kind of construction you've got. So if we've got an active construction with a transitive verb, then we've got an agent, and it will be the agent which becomes the subject, because that is the highest one up. That starts off inside the specifier of the VP. On the other hand, if we've got a passive construction, and that's precisely the one where the agent has gone missing, then the only argument that we've got left then will be the theme, and it'll be the theme that moves up to the subject position. That's not the only thing, however, that moves out of the VP. The verb itself can move out of the VP into the inflection position under a number of conditions. Firstly, the inflection position has to be occupied by a bound morpheme, i.e. The tense morphemes, not the modals or the infinitive. Those are free morphemes, and they won't allow the verb to move into that inflection position. The other thing must be that the verb itself doesn't already carry another morpheme, like the ones we were looking at last week, things like the ing and the n morpheme of the progressive and the perfect and passive. If the verb already supports one of those morphemes, it can't move any higher, and it stays put where it is. And in that case, as we saw last week, we have to insert something else into the inflection position, an auxiliary verb or something like that. Moving on to the middle part of the clause and the IP. The inflection itself can be either a free morpheme, as we've said, that's a modal auxiliary or the infinitival too, or a bound morpheme like tense, past, and present, something like that. The complement of the inflection is always a verb phrase, never anything else, and therefore it's the verbs that are going to move into the inflection position if something is going to move there. The specifier of the IP is empty at D structure. D structure is the level of representing the structure before anything moves, and so the specifier position of the IP is always vacant, always ready to be moved into, and in fact it has to have something in it by the time we get to S structure, that is the level of representation after movement takes place. So there always has to be something in that position by the time we get to the end of the derivation of the sentence. The CP at the very top of the sentence, the complementizer itself can be a complementizer, either something like that or for or if, an overtly pronounced complementizer. However, we've also seen that the complementizer can be unpronounced. That is a covert complementizer. So just because we can't see a complementizer doesn't necessarily mean to say there isn't a complementizer there. On the other hand, the complementizer position can also act as the landing site for a movement, specifically something that moves from the inflection position into the complementizer position. That's I to C movement. So we can get, for example, auxiliary verbs in the complementizer position. That's what we call inversion. Inversion is I to C movement. The complementizer always has an IP as its complement. Okay, so in that complement position of the CP, there's always an IP. And finally, the specifier of the CP, pretty much like the specifier of the IP, is always empty at D structure, so there's nothing put there from the beginning, but it's open and vacant to be moved into. And that's what happens under some circumstances. WH phrases in interrogatives and in relative clauses, for example, will move to that specifier position. The difference between the CP and the IP is that, well, we don't have to move anything into the CP specifier position if the clause is neither a WH interrogative nor a relative clause. Then there'll be no WH phrase to move there, and the specifier position will remain vacant. With the IP, however, as we've seen, that position has to be filled. Okay, so now let's move on to have a look specifically at infinitival clauses. Here's an example of one in its full glory. It's got all its positions filled by something. This clause happens to be sitting in the specifier position of a whole clause, as in for John to win would be great, but it's the for John to win that we're going to be concentrating on. We've got a complementizer for. For is the complementizer that introduces infinitival clauses. We've got the subject, John, here. That's obviously moved out of the verb phrase where John is the argument of the verb to win. But here it's moved out of that and is in the specifier of the IP. And the inflection position is filled by the infinitive to, the inflection element which you get in an infinitival clause. Okay, so that seems to be fairly straightforward. However, note there's another possibility here, and that is to have something like to win would be great. And here we don't have a complementizer, and we don't have the subject. Now, the missing complementizer by itself isn't too much of a problem because, as we've said, complementizers can be phonologically empty, so you don't have to pronounce them. So the fact that there's no complementizer there itself is not a particular problem. But the missing subject is a bit worrying because, as we've been stressing all along, that specifier of the IP position there has to be filled, apparently. Something has to be in that position, and yet here we've got an example of a clause where it doesn't seem as though there's anything in that position. However, that may not be an accurate description of what's going on here, and in fact that maybe something a little bit more abstract is happening, can be shown from the fact that this sentence here doesn't mean that nobody is going to be winning. That is, that win doesn't have any argument at all. In fact, it's fairly clear that if that were the case, that would be an ungrammatical sentence because predicates have to have arguments. So this sentence really does mean that somebody is going to win. It's just that we're not actually saying that who that someone is, or we're not actually pronouncing it. So there's perhaps a reason to believe that although there looks to be nothing in this subject position, there may be something there. It's just that we don't see it for some reason or another. Now, with that in mind, let's turn to this requirement that the subject is necessary to see whether or not that's really true? Is it true that there must be a subject? Well, two reasons we see why that in support of the requirement that there be a subject from a sentence like John will win is from the fact that, well, first of all, John apparently does move out of the verb phrase into the specifier of the IP. Now, if there weren't a requirement that that specifier of the IP be filled by something, then presumably John wouldn't move at all. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with having John inside the verb phrase. In fact, that would be a perfectly possible thing to have from a semantic point of view. John is the person doing the winning, and will expresses the fact that whatever it is that verb phrase is expressing, John's winning, that is going to be happening sometime in the future. So from a semantic point of view, that arrangement of this clause would be perfect. There's no reason from a semantic point of view why John should have to move out of the verb phrase. The fact that John does move out of the verb phrase then would seem to suggest that there is a reason, that something's got to move into that position. And again, the fact that if you don't move the subject out of the verb phrase, well, you simply get an ungrammatical sentence. So we're led to then to the conclusion that, well, something's got to move to that position in these kinds of sentences, and presumably there's a reason for that. Another set of observations which come to the same conclusion is what happens if we do have predicates that themselves don't have subjects. So, for example, a predicate, an adjectival predicate like certain, for example, that basically is a one-place predicate. It has one argument, and the argument that it has is the clause that follows it. So what is certain here is that John is going to win. Certain then doesn't have its own subject argument, and yet in the sentence you put something in that subject position. You get the it is certain that John will win. Now this it, as we've seen before, is basically a meaningless DP. It's what we call a pleonastic subject, a subject which is sitting in that subject position simply because of grammatical requirements. Again, nothing to do with semantics. It doesn't mean anything, so it can't be a semantic requirement that there be a subject there. But if we miss that subject out, we get an ungrammatical sentence. So again, from these observations, it looks as though that the subject position has to be filled. Even if there's no meaningful subject to fill it, we just have to fill it, at this time, with a meaningless subject. All this adds up to that there is some grammatical requirement that there be a grammatical subject. Not a semantic subject, that's not a requirement. Some predicates don't have subjects of their own, but we've got to fit something into that position. So it looks as though there's no getting away from it. Clauses must have subjects, at least by the time we get to S structure. So let's go back to our missing subject clause then. The to win would be great. Well, if we follow the argument up to this point, then we're forced to assume that there really is a subject sitting in that position. So there is a DP, presumably, which is doing the winning, is interpreted as the someone who is going to win, but it's just not pronounced. It's a silent subject. Now, the silent subject of this infinitival clause, traditionally, since the 1970s at least, has been called pro, written in capital letters, sometimes called big pro. And what pro is, and the reason why we call it pro, is because basically it has all the properties of a pronoun. It takes its reference from somewhere else in the sentence, just like a pronoun, like he or him would in a sentence. So basically we refer to it as pro to remind us that it's a kind of pronoun, but specifically it has no pronunciation, no phonology, phonology. Get it right in a second. It doesn't. It's simply unpronounced. Okay, now with that in mind, let's go back to something we talked about several weeks ago. And that is these sentences like John seems to be rich, where we saw that the element John here, the argument John, is related to the lower clause. John is the one who is rich, essentially. And there we were arguing that what seems to be going on in this case is that John starts off in the lower clause and then moves out of it into the upper clause in a case of what we called raising. A raising movement is the movement from a lower clause subject position to a higher clause subject position. However, we've now just introduced this idea of there being a silent pronoun sitting in the subject position. So maybe we could argue that actually that's what's going on in this case. There's no movement here at all, but what we have is a silent pronoun in the lower clause and John is up there in the higher clause already. Now, if this were true, what we would have to interpret this in a way is being that the argument, the unpronounced pronoun, is the argument of the be rich, the one that's interpreted as being rich. And we would have to say that John, as a separate argument, is related to the argument, the predicate seems. So John is the one who seems. Now, that doesn't sound quite right. And that it can't be right is indicated by the fact that under the right circumstances we can see that the verb seem doesn't have a subject of its own. It's one of these predicates that doesn't have its own subject argument. It only has an argument which is the clause that follows it. So in it seems that John is rich. What seems is John is rich, and that it is one of these pleonastic meaningless subjects. So seem as a verb is something that doesn't have an argument. And obviously in this case then, John is interpreted as the argument of being rich. It's clearly true because John is down there in that clause, and seem obviously has no argument of its own. Therefore, at the D structure level, we're going to have this kind of interpretation, and given that the seem that is involved here is pretty much the same as the seem involved with the non-finite infinitival clause seem, in as much as it seems that John is rich and John seems to be rich mean pretty much the same thing, and if we had two different seems, presumably they would mean different things. But given that they mean the same thing, it looks as though we've got the same verb seem, and that verb, as we've said, has no subject of its own. So it seems as though we're going to have to assume that John really is the argument of the predicate in the lower clause, and therefore its proper analysis is one where it moves from that lower position to the higher position rather than being there in the first place and having a pro subject in the lower clause. However, now let's compare that situation with something else. Consider this sentence here: John wants to be rich. Superficially at least, this looks pretty similar to what we've just seen. We've got an overt subject, John, sitting in the higher clause, and we've got a non-finite clause following the predicate want, and that clause seems to be lacking a subject, to be rich. So, could we say that this is exactly the same as what's going on with the raising case, with the seems case? Well, if you compare this one to the previous one, we'll note some rather large differences. First of all, John here is interpreted as the argument of want. John is the one who is doing the wanting. But at the same time, John is also interpreted as the one who is being rich, or if he gets what he wants, he will be in anyway. So John is the argument of two different predicates, the wanter and the one who is rich. But that can't be, because one phrase can't be the argument of two different predicates, because as we've said, at D structure, all arguments sit in the positions where they are related to their predicates. And if you've got an argument that's related to two predicates, that's going to require it to be in two different positions at D structure before anything even moves. And clearly one thing can't be in two positions. So this can't be the right analysis here, where John is the argument of both clauses. Furthermore, we can't adopt a raising analysis here precisely because want is the kind of verb that has its own subject argument. Therefore, we couldn't put a meaningless subject in that position and get "it wants that John is rich," where the "it" is a meaningless "it" rather than a meaningful "it," that thing over there, for example. You couldn't possibly interpret this sentence in that way, like you can with "seem." It seems that John is rich is perfectly fine with a meaningless "it." So clearly then this "want" is very different from "seem," and it doesn't behave in the same way. Now, from what we've said about "want" then, that would seem to suggest that it has exactly this kind of structure where John is sitting in the subject position of "want," and then there is another argument which is the subject of the lower clause. Now, if this is the case, then if we have a subject here, an unpronounced pronoun subject, then John here is interpreted as the argument of "want," and pro would be the argument of "be rich." The reason why we end up with the interpretation that John is related to both predicates is precisely because pro, being a pronoun, takes its reference from somewhere else. So although it's an independent argument, its reference is the same as John. It refers to the same individual, and that's why we get that interpretation. So there seems to be reason to believe then that the kind of construction where we have a pro sitting in the subject position of a non-finite clause here does exist. It's different from the raising case, and we'll compare the raising case to these kinds of constructions presently. The conclusion then we can come to here is that, well, there are different kinds of predicates. There are the kinds of predicates which allow raising to happen. That's predicates like "seem." These are predicates that don't have their own subject arguments, and therefore their subject position is going to be open to be moved into by some other element, particularly the subject of the lower clause. But then there are these other kinds of predicates which do have their own subjects, but can take a non-finite clause with one of these pro-subjects in it itself. We call those predicates control predicates. So "want" is a control predicate, and that's to do with the fact that the pro ends up being interpreted taking the same reference as one of the arguments of the control predicate. So in "John wants to be rich," the pro subject there is controlled, we say, by the subject of "want," i.e. they mean the same thing, they refer to the same thing. Okay, so let's take a look then at the differences between raising and control. Here we've got the representation of a raising verb like "seem" and a control verb like "want" before anything moves. Okay, so looking at these two things, we do see some fairly large differences. First of all, as we've said, "seem" is a verb that has no subject argument of its own. So inside the VP, its specifier position is simply empty. "Want," on the other hand, is a verb that has its own subject argument, and John there is sitting inside that VP in the specifier position. Both clauses take non-finite clausal complements, so we've got a CP sitting in the complement position of these verbs, but again we see a difference here. With the raising verb, the subject of that clause is overt and pronounced, it's John, whereas with the control verb we've got a control clause with a pro subject there, and you can't see it because it's unpronounced. Now, what's going to happen after movement takes place then is that something will have to move into the specifier position of both IPs. In the raising instance, given that the seem verb has no argument of its own, it can't be that moves because there's nothing there. So what has to move in this case is the subject of the lower clause. That's the nearest element that could possibly move there, and therefore that's the element that does move there. And we end up with raising. With control, however, there is an argument in that lower VP, in the VP of the higher clause, and therefore that's the thing that is going to move into the subject position. We can see, therefore, that superficially then, these two sentences end up looking very similar to each other. We've got John sitting in the subject position of both of them, but the difference is where that John came from. In the first case, in the raising case, John has moved all the way out of the lower clause, whereas in the control instance, John has moved from the same clause in the VP position. It looks as though they're the same as well because, again, we've got a non-finite clause with an unpronounced subject. The raising instance has got an unpronounced subject simply because, well, that subject has been moved out of that position and isn't pronounced there anymore. Whereas the control case has got an unpronounced subject because, well, there's an unpronounced pronoun sitting in that position. Let's have a look at some differences in the behaviours of raising and control constructions then. So we'll stick with the same examples. John seems to be rich and John wants to be rich. Now, as we've said, a raising verb doesn't have its own subject, and therefore, under the right circumstances, basically when the clause complement of the verb is finite, then what will happen is we will be able to insert a meaningless subject into that IP specifier position. So because raising verbs don't have their own subjects, they can have meaningless subjects of their own. The same isn't true, however, of control predicates. Control predicates have their own subjects and therefore they can't take meaningless subjects. So it seems that John is rich is fine, but it wants that John is rich is not. Another observation that can be made about the difference between raising and control is that because the subject of the raising verb is actually the real subject of the lower clause, then all the restrictions and all the properties of that subject are to do with the lower clause. The same isn't true of control predicates. The subject was never the subject of the lower clause. It was always the subject of the control predicate. And we can see this by looking at the differences we've got here. If we look at this first example, the cat seems to be out of the bag. We've got a sentence there, the cat is out of the bag. This can be given one of two interpretations. Either a literal interpretation where we've got a particular cat and a particular bag and a locational relationship between the two of them, or we've got what is referred to as the idiomatic reading, where this thing doesn't refer to a cat at all, or even a bag for that matter, but the meaning of the cat seems to be out of the bag, or the cat is out of the bag, is that a secret has become known. Okay, so that's the idiomatic reading. Note, with the raising case, the cat seems to be out of the bag, you can still have the idiomatic reading because the cat, as the subject of that, started off inside the clause and the lower clause, and therefore was associated with that clause from the beginning. And when the cat is the subject of be out of the bag, we can get the idiomatic reading. Same thing is true with the it seemed to be raining case. That it note is actually not the meaningless it of seem. We know that because what we've got in this case is a non-finite clause complement, and seem only has its own it subject when it has a finite clause complement. Instead, what's going on here is that it is to do with the verb of the lower clause. That is, what we've got is one of these weather verbs like rain and snow and other kinds of verbs like that. Take these it subjects, so it is raining. So again, the it subject there is nothing to do with the seem, but is controlled and licensed by the verb of the lower clause, rain. The same can be seen in the next example. There seemed to be no one there. There is not the kind of subject that seem normally takes at all. You can't take a pleonastic there when it has a finite clause. We can't say there seems John likes Mary. It has to be it there. This there, however, is there precisely because it's licensed by the lower clause. There is no one there. Okay, so in that kind of construction we have a there subject, and that's what determines the presence of the there in this case. Compare that to what's going on with the control case. The cat wants to be out of the bag. Here, no possible idiomatic interpretation at all. Here we've got to interpret this to mean a sentence about a literal cat and a literal bag. We can't have it wants to be raining, because that it is a meaningless it associated with the lower clause, and given that it was never part of that lower clause, it can't appear with want. Same thing with there. There wants to be no one there. Can't work because the there is not part of the lower clause at any point, and therefore can't be licensed by that lower clause. So we see then a large difference between raising and control in terms of the properties of the subject. With raising, that subject is always to do with the lower clause, and with the control case, the subject is always to do with the properties of the control verb itself. Finally, there's another property that follows from this distinction between raising and control, and this is to do with what we refer to as split antecedents. To see that, it's best to look at these examples. So in the one case, we've got John seems to Mary to leave together, which is clearly ungrammatical, versus the control case, John persuaded Mary to leave together. And that's perfectly okay. Now, what's going on here? Well, in the raising case, the subject of the lower clause, to leave together, is John. Together is the kind of adverb which can only ever appear with a plural subject, or at least a coordinated subject, which in English behaves like a plural. So John and Mary left together, but you can't say John left together. So here it's fairly obvious why you can't have John seem to Mary to leave together, because here John is the subject of the leave clause, and that's just a singular thing and can't license the use of a plural adverb like together. On the other hand, it's perfectly possible with control. John persuaded Mary to leave together is okay. How come that's okay, whereas it isn't with seem? Well, with control, we've said that the subject is neither John nor Mary in this case, but is in fact an unpronounced pronoun subject. And it turns out that is, as one of its properties, is that it can take its reference from more than one place. Here then, pro takes its reference from both John and Mary. They are the ones who are going to be leaving, and furthermore they're going to be leaving together. So the fact that pro can be interpreted as both John and Mary then licenses the use of together, and that's why we can get this split antecedent possibility. Okay, let's now summarize everything we've said in this lecture then. First of all, we started with this idea that clauses have to have subjects. We've said that that's a little bit more complicated than that, because at D structure the subject position is empty, so they don't have to have subjects from any semantic point of view. It's just that at S structure there seems to be this requirement that something be in that position. We can do that, we can fill that position in one of two ways. We can either move a DP into that position, Or, under the right circumstances, we can insert a meaningless DP into that position, usually something like it or there. Then we've looked at the infinitival clauses, and we've seen that sometimes these infinitival clauses appear to lack subjects. However, we've concluded that they actually don't lack subjects, but there are two different cases which only appear to lack subjects for different reasons. First of all, we have the cases with raising predicates or raising verbs like seem. The non-finite clause that follows seem appears to lack a subject simply because the subject has been moved from that position into the subject position of the raising verb. Therefore, it only looks as though it lacks a subject. It really does have a subject that's been moved. On the other hand, control verbs like want take non-finite clausal complements which appear to lack a subject, but not this time because of movement, but simply because the element that sits in that subject position is an unpronounced pronoun, which we've been referring to as pro. Okay, that's it for today, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.